Frankly, the United States is under attack by entities that are using cyber to penetrate virtually every major action that takes place in the United States. From U.S. businesses to the federal government to state and local governments, the United States is threatened by cyber attacks every day. While Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea pose the greatest cyber threats, other nation states, terrorist organizations, transnational criminal organizations, and ever more technically capable groups and individuals use cyber operations to achieve strategic and malign objectives. Some of these actors, including Russia, are likely to pursue even more aggressive cyber attacks with the intent of degrading our democratic values and weakening our alliances. Persistent and disruptive cyber operations will continue against the United States and our European allies, using elections as opportunities to undermine democracy, sow discord, and undermine our values. Chinese cyber espionage and cyber attack capabilities will continue to support China's national security and economic priorities. Iran will try to penetrate U.S. and allied networks for espionage and lay the groundwork for future cyber attacks. And North Korea will continue to use cyber operations to raise funds, launch attacks, and gather intelligence against the United States. Terrorists will use the internet to raise funds and promote their malign messages. Criminals will exploit cyber tools to finance their operations. Next is Russia, where President Putin will continue to rely on assertive foreign policies to shape outcomes beyond Russia's borders. Putin will resort to more authoritarian tactics to maintain control amid challenges to his rule. With respect to Russian influence efforts, let me be clear. The Russians utilize this tool because it's relatively cheap, it's low risk, it offers what they perceive as plausible deniability, and is proven to be effective at sowing division. We expect Russia to continue using propaganda, social media, false flag personas, sympathetic spokesmen, and other means to influence to try to build on its wide range of operations and exacerbate social and political fissures in the United States. There should be no doubt that Russia perceived that its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 U.S. midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations.
And we all know it's been over a year since the Russian intervention in our 2016 elections. We've also seen Russia intervene in a number of other Western democracies. I'd like each of you to briefly reconfirm to the American public that our intelligence community understands this threat. Last year, those of you who were on the panel each expressed confidence in the January 2017 IC assessment that Russia interfered in the 2016 elections. I'd like each of you today to, one, reaffirm that, and also, with a simple yes or no, do you agree with Director Pompeo that we haven't seen a significant decrease in the Russian activity, and we have every expectation, I think Director Coates, you've already alluded to this, that they'll try to continue to intervene in our elections in 2018 and 2020. I'll start with you, Director Cardell. Simple yes or no will do.
Well, so no change in my view of the 2017 assessment. I support that, and I agree with Director Pompeo's assessment about the likelihood of the 2018 occurrence as well.
I participated in that 2017 work. I stood by it then. I stand by it now, and I agree with Director Pompeo. This is not going to change or stop.
General Ashley.
Yes, it is not going to change, nor is it going to stop.
Throughout the entire community, we have not seen any evidence of any significant change from last year.
I agree with Director Pompeo.
You've been waiting for that answer for a
I
long
have.
time.
I've had that one in the pocket for a while. Yes, sir.
As do I.
One area that I think we were a little all caught off guard on, and to a degree understandably, was how the Russians used social media. And I realize this is a new area for all of us, and there are legitimate issues around American civil rights that have to be balanced. But the fact is, I think we have to have an organized plan going forward. This question will be directed at DNI Coates and Director Ray, but if others want to weigh in, because the notion that these companies, while maybe located here, operate in cyberspace, and when we've got somebody masquerading as Mike Pompeo, but is actually Boris Badenoff in St. Petersburg, it doesn't fit neatly into a particular flowchart. Director Coates and Director Ray, who is in charge of addressing the threat posed by foreign nationals or foreign nations in terms of their use and misuse of social media?
There's no single agency, quote, in charge. There are several agencies throughout the federal government that have equities in this, and we are working together to try to integrate that process. It clearly is something that needs to be addressed and addressed as quickly as possible. You and I have had a number of discussions about that, and so we are keen on moving forward in terms of not only identification but relative response and things that we can do to prevent this from happening. We are gaining more, I think, support, I guess is the right word, from the private sector, who are beginning to recognize ever more the issues that are faced with the material that comes through their processes. We cannot, as a government, direct them what to do, but we certainly are spending every effort we can to work with them to provide some answers to this question.
Dr. Ray.
I would agree with Director Coates. I think it's a team effort, and one of the things that's really jumped out at me since being back in government is how much more of a team the intelligence community is than the last time I was in this space. I have one of Mike's people who sits right, in my inner team and vice versa, and we're dealing with each other, every day. So it's teamwork within the intelligence community and then partnership with the private sector, which is, I think, the other big change I've noticed. There's a lot more forward-leaning engagement with the private sector in terms of trying to share information and raise awareness on their end, because at the end of the day, we can't fully police social media, so we have to work with them so that they can police themselves a little bit better as well.
Well, let me say, I think the companies themselves were slow to recognize this threat. I think they've still got more work to do, but the fact that we don't have clarity in terms of who's in charge means I don't believe we don't have a full plan. Let me just get.
This is an election year in our country, and it's frankly frustrating to me that we haven't passed legislation to help states strengthen the security of their voting systems. Putting that issue aside, there's also going to be an election this year in Latvia, one of our NATO allies. What is your assessment of whether or not the Russians are actively engaged in trying to influence that election, and how concerned is the intelligence community that they might be successful in producing a government that is very sympathetic to Russia's foreign policy objectives?
Not only are we concerned, the 29 nations of NATO are concerned. I returned not that long ago from a meeting in Brussels with the intelligence arm of NATO. All 29 nations, the topic was addressed primarily on Russian meddling in elections and trying to undermine democratic values. At the end of that, the new director of that organization asked for a show of hands of or any verbal response from any representatives of the 29 nations if they thought that Russia had not interfered with their processes and particularly their elections or had the potential to do so. Not one person raised their hand. He said, so do I understand that we are unanimous in assessing what the Russians are trying to do to undermine our elections, to undermine our coordination with the United States and relationships with each other, to undermine the very basic principles of sharing with our European countries, everything that is accomplished through NATO. Do I understand that no one has an objection to it? You all see this for what it is? Dead silent. He said, I take silence to be consent. So I think that says that this is pervasive, that the Russians have a strategy that goes well beyond what's happening here in the United States, even though while they have historically tried to do these kinds of things, clearly in 2016 they upped their game. They took advantage, sophisticated advantage of social media. They're doing that not only in the United States, they're doing that throughout Europe and perhaps elsewhere. And so I think that sends a very strong signal that any elections that are coming up we need to assume that there might be interference with that, particularly from the Russians and maybe from some other malign actors. And steps need to be taken to work with state and local officials because many of these elections in off the year will be state and local, governorships, even members of certain houses of representation within the states themselves. So it clearly is an issue that is whole of government and and I would say this, the more, and we also agreed with this at Brussels, and I've tried to make that point while I was there, the more transparency we can provide to the American people, to people of nations that see this threat coming, the better off we will be. Obviously, we have to take other measures, but we need to inform the American public that this is real, that this is going to be happen, and the resilience needed for us to stand up and say, we're not going to allow some Russian to tell us how to vote, how we ought to run our country.
Some of the things we can do to be more helpful to local election officials and encouraging them to share information when they think their systems are being attacked, getting more information to them than we have. There was a lot of criticism in the last cycle that we knew that some election systems were being attacked and didn't tell them they were being attacked. And so the three of you, in any order, any thoughts you have on what we can do to protect the critical infrastructure of the election system and how quickly we need to act if we intend to do that this year.
Well, the intelligence community, all elements of it are aware, and we want to collect and provide as much information as we can so that we can give those warnings and alerts, so that we can share information back and forth with local and state and election processes with the federal government. Department of Homeland Security, Department of FBI, obviously are more involved given these are domestic issues, but we do look to every piece of intelligence we can gather so that we can provide these warnings. It is an effort that I think the government needs to put together at the state and local level and work with those individuals who are engaged in the election process in terms of the security of their machines. Cyber plays a major role here, and so I think it is clearly an area where the federal government, foreign collection on potential threats and of interference, warnings, and then processes in terms of how to put in place security and secure that to ensure the American people that their vote is sanctioned and well and not manipulated in any way whatsoever.
Director Pompeo.
Senator Blunt, when I answered Senator Heinrich's question earlier, I was referring to the former, the first part of your question, not truly to the latter. The things we've seen Russia doing to date are mostly focused on information types of warfare, the things that Senator Warner was speaking out most directly earlier. With respect to the CIA's role, and I think Admiral Rogers will say his too, we have two missions. One is to identify the source of this information, make those here domestically aware of it so that they can do the things they need to do, whether that's FBI or DHS, so that they have that information. We are working diligently along many threat vectors to do that. And then the second thing, and we can talk more about this afternoon, is we do have some capabilities offensively to raise the cost for those who would dare challenge the United States elections.
And after Admiral Rogers, Director Ray, I may want to come to you and see on that same sharing information, any impediments to sharing that information with local officials, or any reason we wouldn't want to do that. Admiral Rogers?
Senator, the only other thing I would add, and this is also shaped by my experience as Cyber Command, where I defend networks, is one of the things that we generally find in that role, many network and system operators do not truly understand their own structures and systems. And so one of the things that I think is part of this is how do we help those local, federal, state entities truly understand their network structure, what its potential vulnerabilities, and to harness this information that the intelligence structure and other elements are providing them. It's not necessarily an intel function, but I think it's part of how do we work our way through this process.
Director Ray?
Senator, I think this is one of the areas that there's been a lot of discussion about whether we're doing better, and this is one of the areas I think we are doing better. We together at the FBI, together with DHS, recently, for example, scheduled meetings with various state election officials, and normally the barrier there would be classification concerns, whether somebody had clearances. We were able to put together briefings appropriately tailored and with non-disclosure agreements with those officials. So there are ways, if people are a little bit creative and forward-leaning, to educate the state election officials, which is, of course, where elections are run in this country.
I'd say, has the President directed you and your agency to take specific actions to confront and blunt Russian influence activities that are ongoing?
We're taking a lot of specific efforts to blunt
Are
Russian
they directed by the President?
Not as specifically directed by the President.
Okay. Director Pompeo, have you received a specific presidential direction to take steps to disrupt these activities? Could you put it on?
Sorry. I'm not sure how specific. I mean, the President's made very clear we have an obligation from our perspective, from foreign intelligence perspective, to do everything we can to make sure that there's a deep and thorough understanding of every threat, including threats from Russia.
But as he singled out the Russian threat, which appears to be critical to this election coming up, I know there are threats from many different vectors, but have you received the specific threat, i.e. it's very important to him to get this done correctly?
Yeah, I think the President's been very clear that he has asked our agency to cooperate with each of the investigations that's ongoing and do everything we can to ensure that we thoroughly understand this potential threat.
Director Coates, have you received a specific directive to take specific steps to disrupt and understand first and then disrupt Russian activities directed at our elections in 2018?
I would echo what Director Pompeo just said. We work together on this. It's throughout the agency. Has full understanding that we are to provide whatever intelligence is relevant and make sure that that is passed on to our policymakers, including the President.
Passing on relevant intelligence is not actively disrupting the operations of an opponent. Do you agree?
No, we pass it on and they make the decisions of how to implement it.
As the Director of Intelligence, have you are aware of or leading an interagency and intergovernmental working group that is tasked with countering Russian activities, not merely reporting on it, but tasked with countering those activities? Are you aware of any type of interagency group, any intergovernmental groups, since state elections are critical or state elected officials are critical?
Well, we essentially are relying on the investigations that are underway,
So the answer
both with this
Senator-
committee and the HIPSI committee and as well as the special counsel.
So you're not taking any specific steps based on the intelligence to disrupt Russian activities that are occurring at this
We
moment?
take all kinds of steps to disrupt Russian activities in terms of what they're trying to do. I think I'll turn it over to Director Pompeo to.
Let me finish with the rest of the gentlemen. Are you finished, Mr. Coates?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Senator Reed, we have a significant effort. I'm happy to talk to you about in closed section. The CIA is, and it is not just our effort. It is certainly all of IC effort. There may be others participating as well to do our best to push back against this threat. And it's not just the Russian threat. It's Iranians and Chinese. It's a big, broad effort.
I understand,
Yep.
Mr. Director. We have mutual threats, but one threat that has been central to our, and you've testified this publicly, the last election there was a Russian influence. This election, they seem to be more prepared. They've learned their lessons. The simple question I've posed is, have the President directed the intelligence community in a coordinated effort, not merely to report, but to actively stop this activity? And the answer seems to be, I'm hearing, is the reporting's going on as we're reporting about every threat coming into the United States. Let me get back to, quickly, do any of the other panelists have anything to add on this point?
For us, I can't say that I've been explicitly directed to, quote, blunt or actively stop. On the other hand, it's very clear, generate knowledge and insight, help us understand this so we can generate better policy. That direction has been very explicit in fairness.
But I think, again, you may agree or disagree, collecting intelligence, then acting on it in a coordinated fashion are two different things.
Yes, sir. I'd also argue what's our role as intelligence professionals in all this.
Let me just, and I've got very few moments remaining. We've talked a lot about China, CFIUS, their involvement in trying